9/11 was a fateful day, not just for myself personally and professionally, although I did not know that when I woke up. But it was a huge and significant, as it turned out, fateful day for not just the nation, but also for NSA as an institution. What I didn't know early in that morning is how much would change because of 9/11. Well, in terms of my career, I spent a lot of time in the government and as a contractor with the government. I actually took the oath to support and defend the Constitution 4 times in my government career. That started in the Air Force when I flew on RC-135s in Europe during the latter years of the Cold War when I was an aircrew member. I was also at CIA for a short time. I was in the Navy as an intel officer at the Pentagon, and then at NSA as a senior executive. And in between, I was a contractor with the government. Why I came to NSA is quite a story in itself. I mean, in summary, NSA was severely challenged by the internet and digital age. They were having great difficulty making sense of large amounts of data. They were trying their best using their legacy thinking to deal with this new dynamic, and they were essentially overwhelmed. And they were increasingly growing deaf, to say it that way, and understanding what they were even collecting. There was no problem in collecting it. It was increasingly a problem in making sense of it. So they had a whole lot of initiatives. How do we continue to make ourselves relevant? How do we meet the challenges of the 21st century? They even called it a challenge problem. It was one of the critical challenge problems. And so I was one of about a dozen people that were hired in under General Hayden, the then director of NSA, to help them make that shift. And that was at the management level, that was at the technical level, and as well as at the process level. How do you actually do work? And I was being dropped in at a rather senior level. This was not a low-level position. This was not a position in which you were way buried deep. I was at the very senior levels of NSA, so became intimately familiar with all the lead players. So the solution was, let's go out to the military-industrial complex, let's spend billions of dollars because it's a really big problem that requires really big money, and we need a really big contract vehicle. And Trailblazer was that centerpiece contract. And they literally put all their eggs in one basket. And it was launched with great fanfare in the spring of 2000. Now, 9/11 occurs. I was charged with finding the very best at NSA to put into the fight. Obviously, it had been a systemic failure, although leadership did not look at it as a failure. One of the typical responses by NSA leadership was 9/11 is a gift to NSA. We'll get all the money we need and then some. As if money was the answer. Money was never the answer. In fact, money just complicated it, especially large amounts of money. So I did that. I took the lead. I was charged as a lead, and I discovered another number of programs that could be used to truly catapult NSA into the 21st century and make sense of all this enormous data. And one of those programs was called Thinthread, an extraordinary program, a revolutionary breakthrough program designed by the very best in NSA and by Americans who clearly evidenced and demonstrated that necessity is the mother of all invention. And so that ingenuity, that spirit of inventiveness, creativity had solved the big challenge problem at NSA, which was how do we make sense of all this data? Doing so while also providing critical intelligence regarding real threats, and also protecting the rights of citizens. And in the United States, those rights were protected by the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. There are no checks and balances. All those checks and balances were removed in secret after 9/11. Yeah, that's the truth. So the executive branch, as a result of the failure of 9/11, decided that the Constitution was in the way, and they unchained themselves, in particular from the Fourth Amendment. In the deepest of secrecy, said, you know what, we just need all the data. I mean, this was an extraordinary development, even in U.S. history. There's no declared war. The threat clearly was now Al-Qaeda and associated movements. That was clear even at the national security level. But instead of actually dealing with the threat directly, and very focused, because they had great sympathy from the rest of the world as a result of 9/11, in the deepest of secrecy, they used that as cover to simply acquire as much data as possible. Because that was a way in which you could guarantee, and this was the theory, if we build a really, really big haystack, we'll be able to find the needle. And so the government unchained itself. And I was eyewitness to that. And it was fundamentally departing from the foundational practices and principles of a constitutional republic. And I knew that we were no longer just in a vehicle where the wheels came off. We were in an entirely different vehicle, a different form of governance, a secret executive, raw power being exercised without any public knowledge, in total violation of the Constitution, and doing so without any regard to any checks or balances, and manipulating the rest of government, including both the legislative and the judicial branch, basically manipulating the truth and hiding the truth from them so they didn't know what they were doing. But this was all ostensibly to provide for the defense of the United States and its interests. And so there was no public interest justification made. There was no probable cause public interest justification made. No one knew about it except a very few of us in secret. To raise concerns as a whistleblower, or simply to just bring up issues of concern, I was doing so as a whistleblower. There are procedures even within NSA administratively to do so, and that's normal. That's directed, or the accountability for that rests with the Inspector General's office. Unfortunately, the Inspector General's office was completely corrupted. It was not independent. It reported to the director of NSA. So they certainly were compromised, or I could say co-opted, by the leadership structure institutionally at NSA. But I did go directly to my supervisor, who was the number 3 person and headed up the Signals Intelligence Directorate. And then she would not deal with what I was bringing to her attention. It was clear that she, as conflicted as she was simply going to go along with the corporate decision and not stand up to it. And so I ended up having a conversation with the lead attorney at NSA. And that lead attorney was the one who had helped approve, was part of the small team of lawyers who said it was all legal. And he flat out told me, you don't understand, Mr. Drake. The White House has approved the program. It was always called the program. This was the secret surveillance program. That was my full moment of truth. I'd already had evidence, significant material evidence prior to that first week in October, that the government in secret was off the rails, right? And was in total violation of the Constitution. And I knew in that moment that Pandora's box had been opened up. And I knew in that moment that I could not remain silent. That if I remained silent, that I would be complicit in a crime. I'd be an accessory to a crime. I would be an eyewitness to a crime. And because I remained silent, I was as guilty as they were. And so I chose to speak up and speak out. And I did so within the system for a number of years until I no longer could. I never was asked, interesting enough, to appear before that commission. A lot of people have assumed I was. I wasn't. I know why, as others had told me later. The information I had provided the 9/11 congressional investigations was white-hot evidence of wrongdoing and illegality and prima facie evidence that NSA was culpable in 9/11. NSA had critical intelligence that they had not shared. Information, if they had shared, probably would have stopped 9/11 all by itself. And they engaged in a massive cover-up to protect the fact that they actually had that information and did not share it. In 2005, December, a blockbuster article is published in the New York Times, revealing for the first time publicly the existence of what became known as a so-called warrantless wiretapping program, which in itself was just the tip of the iceberg. This caused a huge response from within the government. And they launched two weeks later, on December 30th, the Department of Justice launched a massive criminal national security leak investigation, seeking out the sources for the New York Times article. I knew then that I would get caught up in the dragnet of that investigation. I couldn't roll back the clock, but I was also a whistleblower. There was one avenue that was the third rail. You go outside the system and you disclose what you know to the press. And I did that in February of 2006. I already knew something I'd blown the whistle on within the system, that NSA was spying on journalists and reporters. It wasn't just mass dragnet collection of metadata information and phone records and internet usage and credit card information. All of that was part of the secret surveillance program. I already knew they had a special program, a cutout, in which they were specifically targeting journalists and reporters. And the reason they were doing that was if there was any attempt by anybody from the inside to disclose state secrets, they would know or have a good sense of knowing who that was. I already know this, so how do you contact someone in the press without getting noticed? I had to take extraordinary means, which I will not go into here, extraordinary technical means, to make that even initial contact possible, knowing I could be compromised and assuming I would be compromised all the time or at any time by virtue of any contact with the reporter, no matter what form it took. So I crossed over into a space in which I'm now wide open and I could lose my job or worse. I knew that. There was an administrative policy at NSA that if you had unauthorized contact with a reporter, you could, under administrative procedures, you could lose your job because we no longer trust you to hold a security clearance, which is the condition of continuing employment. So I went to the press with what I knew in the public interest. I was eyewitness to the government unchaining itself from the Constitution, the very foundation and bedrock of our government. That grand experiment launched over 220 years ago. I was eyewitness to massive fraud, waste, and abuse. I was eyewitness to the most significant of all the intelligence failures of NSA, which was 9/11. And I knew NSA was culpable. All of this dirty knowledge, how do I share that in a way that is quote unquote unclassified, but still provides what's crucial for in the public interest? So I did that with the reporter over a period of about a year and a half. I was getting ready to go to work. I was upstairs and I looked out the window and I saw all these agents streaming across the front yard, and of course my heart goes up my throat because now when had showed up. It was no longer if, when is now in the front yard. And I heard this rather loud knock several times at the front door. And I knew the nightmare had now begun, the true nightmare. And it was fraught with uncertainty. At the time they raided me, and if you read the search warrant, it was clear that the primary focus was the New York Times article. And they assumed, wrongly, that I was the centerpiece culprit. I was the source. I was the ringleader that was providing, because there was no evidence, which meant I must have been a really, really good spy. No evidence, but because there was no evidence, that made me even more suspicious. It's one of the ironies in this investigation. Where there is no evidence means that there must be evidence. We just haven't found it yet. So let's go take them out. So I was unceremoniously visited by the FBI. And they took away all kinds of personal effects. Electronic, paper, you name it. One of the reasons they came was to take off the street anything that would make NSA culpable. It's important to say that. It wasn't just looking for evidence to prosecute and perhaps even indict me as part of that prosecution, but it was to take evidence off the street. I had unclassified evidence from all of the whistleblower disclosures that I had made within the government. I was actually informed to keep what I could that was unclassified. Obviously the classified stuff I left behind. I didn't actually keep the classified. So I kept all that, but it didn't matter to the government. They ended up doing what's called a forced classification review and made parts of that, both electronic as well as the paper, they turned it into classified. And then they said that I had caused exceptionally grave damage, which is the highest form of damage to the national security of the United States. Next 2.5 years, I was waiting for something worse to happen. So in April of 2010, I was formally indicted under a 10 felony count, facing 35 years in prison by the Department of Justice. And they made it very, very public. I was the first whistleblower since Daniel Ellsberg, charged in like manner. I was charged with 5 counts of espionage, 1 for obstruction of justice, and 4 for making false statements to FBI agents. Now the real nightmare, because now I'm under formal indictment, and I have to go through the justice system of the United States. I'm booked, they take my fingerprints, you get the mug shot, there's an arraignment. I plead not guilty to all 10 felony counts. The government tried to make a case I was a flight risk. The judge didn't accept it, but they did confiscate my passport, and they put me under severe travel restrictions. The only thing they didn't do is put a ankle bracelet on me to track me. But I had to get special permission from the court, with the government having right of first refusal to travel outside the local area. I'm now a criminal defendant. I had already exhausted all of my funds. I was essentially bankrupt and broken. I was declared indigent before the court after I filed the paperwork. I was appointed federal public defenders. I was unable to find any other private attorney who would represent me pro bono, because I had no money left. No one else came to my support, right? And so I knew I was behind several 8 balls. And I'm facing public trial. And I'm facing the distinct prospect that I can end up in prison for any number of years. In the end, the combination of criminal defense by my attorneys within the system before the judge, and then an extraordinary defense led by Jocelyn Radak in the Court of Public Opinion from the Government Accountability Project was able to turn the tide. And it was in the public interest. I wasn't a leaker, I was a whistleblower. I was able to hold off the government. I ended up pleading out to a minor misdemeanor for exceeding authorized use of computer. They dropped but the condition was they dropped all 10 felony counts. There was no jail time, there was no fine. I had community service of 240 hours and 1 year probation. And I was able to keep my freedoms. I was able to keep my liberties. I was able to retain my rights as a citizen, a sovereign citizen. It means more to me now than ever. They were never taken away. what comes to mind, because I'm here in England, I'm here in the United Kingdom, I've lived in England, I consider the United Kingdom a second home. I flew reconnaissance missions during the end of the Cold War. Against which country? East Germany and the Warsaw Pact, right? I was a German-Russian linguist. I got to know that environment very, very well. Never did I imagine that it was supposed to be, the city on a hill, the vaunted principles and practices of constitutional democracy would actually use the Stasi surveillance template as the playbook for a surveillance state the world has never seen, a virtual surveillance state that we've never seen in terms of scope and scale, in partnership, mind you, with GCHQ. What does this mean? Well, Magna Carta, does that mean anything? The Magna Carta was seminal in separating out the divine right of kings. You weren't just subject to the whims of a king. Well, what's happening here, citizens with rights, citizens who are supposed to have protections, are now having those routinely violated in secret and through these extraordinary agreements and partnerships and arrangements with corporations. To what? Become subjects of the state for surveillance purposes, with the argument that if you've done nothing wrong, there's nothing to hide, which means there's no privacy under that. That's a presumption of no privacy. It means privacy is fair game. Anything that's personal is fair game, because we need to ensure that you're up to no good. Is that really the society we want to live in? Benjamin Franklin in the United States said it perfectly, and I'm paraphrasing him. Those who would seek a little safety for the sake of security will lose both. We end up giving up both. I don't want to do that. It's about who we are as human beings. It's about the essence of our ability to associate and create. We're extraordinary in terms of who we are. We're at our best when we're working with each other, not when we're at odds, not when we're divided. And our surveillance state takes us apart. It fragments who we are. I will resist that for the rest of my life with every fiber in my being. Because life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is really worth it. And who would dare come up to take that away from us?